Welcome to the Fancy Thinker, and today we have a special edition of Reading the Prose. This is Reading the Prose number 12, I believe. And for this special edition, I am joined by a very special guest, AP Canavan from A Critical Dragon. My first ever guest on Reading the Prose. How are you today, AP?
I am doing very well, Jared. Thank you very much for inviting me. Um, this this is the kind of thing, and I do videos like this occasionally on my channel as well. But this is the kind of thing that I love. I love exploring what a writer is doing, how they are doing it, and you have this brilliant series where putting something up and go, this is representative of what an author does or their style in this particular thing. And you pick out different elements, and it's not explaining the whole novel, it's not
Right.
giving away what's going to happen in the book. It's fundamentally, if you enjoy reading this, if you see how they're doing it, then this might be a book that you'll enjoy reading. But also, it's the education behind it. When you're reading, like, pay attention, because you will see things like this, and the more you know about it, the more you practice it, the more it becomes automatic,
Hmm.
and
That is
you
correct.
don't have to think about it anymore. It's your brain is automatically just picking little things and making notes of little things in the background.
Yeah, and I think
um,
you brought up the term before. Reading is a skill like any other,
yeah.
and so the more practice you get at it, the the more you'll pick up things like this, and you'll get out of it. And part of this is these are the things that stand out to me. It may not necessarily stand out to somebody else. Everybody has their own things that are gonna
Mhm.
grasp their attention and that they're gonna look at and find something particular about a piece of prose. And But I just like to share the things that I find, and hopefully other people will enjoy that as well.
and, and that is the perfect thing to do, because it's never about you must read it this way, or
Correct.
this is what you must think about this. It's always, here's this thing, this is something I enjoy, and I enjoy reading, and these are elements in it that I can see. And other people might see other elements, or they might interpret
Right.
the same elements that you see, but in a different way.
In a different
And
way. Yeah.
that's part of the conversation about reading, about books, about literature, about this pastime that we all share and love. It's all about learning from each other's experiences and abilities, and what we've been trained for, or the different cultures we come from that allow us to see things in a different way.
Absolutely. Agree 100%. And so today we're going to be looking at a couple of small passages from Stephen Erikson's Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart. Um, if you've been watching my channel, you know we just did a book think episode on this very book where we talked about the grander themes and the bigger picture, so to speak, on this book. But now we're going to take a look at a couple of small passages and just try to pick those apart a little bit and see what makes them tick for us. Um, and of course, AP, you're well known for looking at prologues in books, Professor Prologue, if you will.
But there's a reason for looking at prologues.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the obvious things is these are videos that we do, and they can be seen by anyone. And if someone hasn't read a book and you do a video dissecting the end of a book, that can ruin the book for them if they're
Yeah.
the type of reader that really wants to avoid spoilers. If you do the prologue, you've ruined the first page, 2 pages, 3 pages of a book. And you go, yeah,
Big deal.
but
Yeah.
you have the entirety of the book. This will give you an insight into maybe the style that's being used, or elements that we should be looking out for as the book progresses. That it all depends on the type of prologue. But by doing something from the very start, you minimize, or at least mitigate, the impact that you can have on spoilers.
That is true, and I haven't done too many prologues myself, but I always try to pick a passage that's not gets out of context. It's not going to be any kind of spoiler type material that's going to ruin any part of the other book. And then I try to explain a small bit of context just so the words have relevance. But with that said, we will going to start here with the prologue. And let me put it up here. So I hope that's good enough for everybody to read. Would you like to do the honors?
Well, it's your channel. Shouldn't you be reading it?
Okay. All right. All right. So here we go. We'll do the first 3 paragraphs here. It says, space was astir. In the scatter of asteroids in orbit between Mars and Jupiter, small objects burst into being like clouds of gnats rising from an unseen pond. They were small, none larger than an average SUV. But as one moment led to the next, these machine clouds proliferated. Before long, the swarms numbered in the hundreds, and the objects numbered in the tens of thousands. The clouds, mostly unlit, barring the faint reflection of the distant sun's light, dispersed from their point of origin. At astonishing velocities, they set off among the asteroids. Others winged outward, quickly leaving the relatively crowded space of the belt's field of rubble. Still others raced towards Mars. Over the next few hours and days, the machine clouds among the asteroids settled on select chunks of rock, some metal-rich, others more comet-like and heavy with frozen water, methane, ammonia, and a carbon skin of space dust. On each of these asteroids, the objects clustered on one side exclusively. Extending filaments, they linked up and then settled in. A dozen other clouds converged on the largest asteroid in the immediate area. These too linked up, only to then disgorge smaller machines. They began devouring rock. So, I like some of the alliteration he had in that first paragraph there. We have this, the space is a stir. We have a scatter, small, so there's a good amount of alliteration there. But what is this prologue telling us specifically about this book to come?
Well, let's focus just on that first paragraph.
Yeah.
We can talk about other elements in a minute, but let's focus on the first. So space was a stir, and people talk a lot about the impact that opening sentences can have. Space was a stir. When we think of space, we tend to think of big, empty, black, vast, and very slow. Like even a comet that is hurtling through space, because of the scale, it is crawling. It is barely moving. We think of space as almost without discernible motion. And the opening of this belies all of that. Space was a stir. We get a sense motion, frenetic motion. Things are happening. Stuff is going on. And it's not localized. It's this big concept that's happening. So just in that opening 3 words,
Mm-hmm.
That's what I get from it. Space was a stir. Things were occurring. Stuff is happening. And it's happening in the vastness of space. So what is so big, so tumultuous, so noticeable that in the vastness of space, we can point to it. It is worthy of notice, which is suggestive of scale. And of course, this entire novel is about a cataclysmic or catastrophe that occurs to humanity, something that is shifting the very perception of reality. That's how huge the ramifications are for the planet, for humanity, for the earth. And that's suggested in those first 3 words. Now, it doesn't have all of that meaning. Obviously, this is connected to what goes on in the novel, but you can see the seeds of the scale being sown at the very beginning.
Yeah. Gives
And
you a sense of
interestingly,
action.
yeah. Oh well, yeah, and action. There's movement. There's stuff going on. But one of the things that I really like is the sense of scale is a focus in this first paragraph, because space was a start. So we get space, this huge vastness, basically empty, nothing there. There's no planet. Um, then we have a scatter of asteroids. So again, this idea of just a small amount of things, a small number of things between Mars and Jupiter, small objects like clouds of gnats. So we
Yeah.
suddenly again scale is being
Scale.
played, that because we can visualize a pond of water and then those tiny, tiny little flies that are in these clouds above the water. That is really easy for us to visualize. And because of that, that simile
Yeah.
makes this idea of the scale of Mars and the scale of Jupiter and these gnats rising up, it gives you a sense of scale. It gives you a sense somewhere to stand and to try and visualize it. And then we're told they were small, none larger than an average SUV.
Yeah.
And that's where the human scale suddenly goes, what? An SUV isn't small.
Yeah.
But in terms of the solar system, in terms of space, an SUV is minute. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, that is the first hint that we get that this is not anthropocentric. This is not focused on placing humanity at the center as the scale to understand things. There is a different point of view being used here, and it's being related or relayed to us using things that we can understand, but
Yeah.
making humanity tiny.
Yeah. And that use of SUV, it cracked me up when I first read it because it immediately gave you a sense of modern colloquialism colloquialism that 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 this is happening today, so to speak. It's definitely because space was a stir. It could mean a space opera. It could mean it could mean a Star Trek science fiction. Far in the future, whatever. But that use of SUV right there, in comparison to gnats, once you said gave the scale and the size, but it also just gave it this like sense of, all right, this is happening right now. This is a modern term that everybody knows.
Yeah, and we've moved from the sort of space galactic sort of style into localizing it asteroids, Mars, and Jupiter. So the picture closes down.
Yep.
Then we get that sense of scale with gnats. And then, as you point out, the use of SUV, a terminology from today, from the now, from the late 20th, early 21st century. That's when this term is. So the physical setting has gone from space to our solar system, and now we're getting the time period that's been narrowed down, and it's all done just very, very neatly. And I think concision in writing, we sometimes confuse. Well, why didn't there were nano machines operating on asteroids? There, I've made it a lot shorter, but you haven't made all of the things. Concision in writing is about trying to convey all of the information, including the feeling and the scale and the tone and the atmosphere. Although, that's why you don't have parties on the moon, no atmosphere.
Bidding.
Um, but trying to convey all of this, and it's always a balance, and it's always something that an author has to weigh up. Adding more words is going to make sentences longer. It might make things more cumbersome, but it's going to add more information. And shortening things can make things shorter, more concise, easier to read, but you're going to be losing some information. So it's a balance between what is being portrayed, what is being implied, what has been excised, and what is still there.
Yeah, and he brings it back out at the end of the paragraph. He expands it back out into large scale when he says the objects numbered in the tens of thousands. So now we went from a big scale to a small one, then back out to a big scale again.
And because like clouds of gnats, have you ever tried to count the number of gnats? When you go out and you're walking through a park and it's that evening time and you can see them. These at home we would call them midges.
Yeah.
Would have been the term, but these little tiny biting insects, and it's a mass of them, and the only reason you can see them is because there are so many that the sunlight is bouncing off some of them, and suddenly like the cloud is illuminated, that you can't see all of them because they're all so tiny. And if you thought about that number, you go, my God, there's a lot of them. And it's when we then think and we make that comparison, because we've been led to make this comparison. So these gnats are the size of SUVs. And so we get a sense of not only the scale and the number and the size, but it then helps us zoom all the way out, that how big is this thing that's going on? That SUVs are the size of gnats moving like that.
Yeah.
And that's how we are perceiving. That's how far away we are from the event. So it's actually placing the viewer, the reader, at a distance from what is going on. It's something that's happening over there, not right in front of us.
Very good. All right. And moving on, we get a bit more explanation here about these clouds and these velocities and stuff like that, and where they're going a little bit. Some race towards Mars, some just go leave the crowded space of the asteroid belt, and some settle on chunks of rocks, and he gets into the different different elements that are on these rocks and stuff like that. So he's giving us a sense of place and like what everything's made of. And how do you think all that ties into what the novel is later trying to tell us?
Well, one of the things I point out here, so if we look at that first paragraph, so we have a scatter of asteroids, we have Mars and Jupiter, we have machine clouds proliferated. And in the modern day, we talk a lot about making things simple, but this is signaling science fiction. How do we know in this opening that it's signaling science fiction?
Right.
And machine clouds, there's your first kind of science fictional term. Everything else could be in an astronomer looking at something in the night sky. But as soon as you get machine clouds, you're moving into that science fictional realm. So that kind of ups the diction level slightly, and that's why we get methane, ammonia, carbon skin of space dust, astonishing velocities, not speed, velocity, because it's situating the reader in the style of language that is going to be used. It is not heavily science fictional. We're not talking about the nanoparticle cyber cloud engulf, blah blah. The door dilated. It's not about estrangement here. It's not about a science fictional removal to contrast with our reality. It's framing the science fictional construct in our terminology, but recognizably SF. And I think like some of that is being signaled here, because at astonishing velocities, others winged outward that you don't have. So winged is a much more organic term. It's not a science fictional term. So we're getting this balance of the organic and inorganic, that these were clouds of gnats the size of SUVs, that there's a constant movement in this between inorganic and organic, the balancing of what life is in its different forms, in its constituent elements, but also in how it moves and consumes. And we see that if you're going to be talking about an AI, if you're going to have artificial intelligence, it is a being, it is a consciousness, but clearly it thinks, acts, perceives reality very, very differently to us. It doesn't eat in the same way that we eat, but it will consume. It needs fuel, but we don't generally regard our food as fuel. But there's this this opening, we have that balance between organic, inorganic, science fictional,
That's
the reality.
that's actually a very good point. That's yeah, that really tells us about the work to come, basically. That's good. All right.
And like one of the neat things. So we saw in that opening of the sense of space being relayed to us in human terms. The gnats above the pond, the average size of the size of an average SUV. But then look at how the time frame is referred to over the next few hours and days. So it is localizing the perception of time from an earther's perspective, from our perspective. It is how we perceive time.
That's right. Yep.
And so again, this grand dance that is occurring in space. The focal point is still Earth. That's where this is being viewed from. That's where we're standing, because we're perceiving everything in Earth terms, in Earth temporal framing, in the chronology of how we think about things. And I thought that was a very neat way of setting up. It's science fiction, but it's not space opera. There are big things going on, but it's about how it impacts us. That all of this is signaled in this language, and of course, like, it's once you've read the book and you look back on it, you can see all of these things. But again, when authors are writing and they go back and they edit, like, it's not that they write this and then go, oh, well, no, that's not done, and I'll never look at it again. Most times, authors are actually quite deliberate to tie elements together, particularly when they've included a prologue. And not all authors write their prologue as the first thing that they write. Sometimes the prologue is constructed or reconstructed or added. Once they've finished the whole thing, they know where they've ended up. And then they put the prologue in that is sort of tying it all together.
Tying it all together, yeah. Yeah, and also giving us hints, and also giving us thematic hints about what's to come, tying it all in, and also giving us, you're able to put together ideas in the prologue that just like this may bring out the themes and the general contrast later on in the novel. Yeah.
And one last thing that I would say about this, just looking at the sentence construction, look at the number of clauses and the number of words to a sentence. This is not complicated prose. This is not highly ambiguous prose. This is very straightforward, journalistic. No,
yes.
it's still using some complex ideas, and it's using that slightly higher level. You need to be scientifically literate to some degree to recognize methane, ammonia, but they're not foreign words. They're not strange words.
Yeah, right. Yeah, filaments. Words like that. You'd have to have a little bit of learning just to understand disgorge and stuff like that. But you're right. It's not. He's not. Flowering things up at all. He's not giving us like a poetic cadence, I would say. It's very straightforward, and he's telling us information.
Yeah. So it's not lyrical. It's not extravagant. It's not overblown. This is quite factual. So although, you have like clouds, you have a simile, you have comparisons, but it's not into that realm of high figurative language or very expressive language. It is actually quite plain spoken. And that, for readers of Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, that might come as a bit of a shock. It's not written in the same style. This is much more journalistic. This is much more plain spoken. It's much closer to what you would consider sort of transparent prose. That it's a different style than the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Yep, very good, very good. All right, so we're going to move on to another section here. This section takes place at the beginning of chapter 2, and it's where we're first introduced to our main character, Samantha, in the book. And it's just a short little character piece that gives us a little insight into how she thinks and how she how we the reader are going to view her um, right off the bat. Um, so we'll read it off here first. She wanted a cigarette, a visceral desire. Systemic flags flipped up. The humbling reality of addiction was, she believed, a worthwhile investment in humility. Most of the communication between the body and the mind was murky, swimming the subconscious depths of autonomic necessity. The need to breathe defined itself, instant by instant. Hunger spoke in pangs, a spurt of saliva at the thought of a perfect BLT. Bright light or the flashing proximity of an object snapped shut the eyes. A list of the more obvious exchanges. The other exchanges were far subtler, beneath notice. But caffeine withdrawal delivered a headache. Nicotine withdrawal, a not quite itch to the throat. General edginess for both, the wordless want awaiting articulation. Humility was useful, especially for a writer. It made it easier and less personally offensive to see or imagine the world in other ways. Contrary opinions on how the way things worked. In all those mercurial mechanisms of human interaction, belief, politics, faiths, attitudes, opinions, for the addict, piety was the first self delusion to go. It yanked the stick out of the ass, or arse, I think is the word in my book. But um,
Yeah.
so when I first read this, I was like, okay, this is a look into Samantha's outlook. This is a lot of clues to her character, and to put it in context, she's just awakening from being abducted. This happens right in the second chapter, so it's not a big spoiler there. And it's the point of the book is her interaction with the first contact. Um, and I really loved how we're getting her character through her just first perception of what she feels when she first wakes up, and that's how we're getting her character. And I loved how he put that together into this passage here.
And I think you hit the nail on the head with this. The very first thing that she thinks of when she wakes up is the thing that she's addicted to. And that tells us a number of different things. The first thing it tells us, it's been some time since she was abducted.
Yep.
And she measures that in that the craving is already kicked in, that she's already aware of it. So time has passed. And it's a very neat way to note the passage of time. She's looking for her next hit. And then as this strikes her, we get an insight into how she thinks. Because she wants this, she immediately thinks, why do I want this? What is this similar to? We see how her brain works, how she thinks about the world, how she approaches it. Because while this is not stream of consciousness, it's giving us that insight into how she thinks. So she starts thinking about it. These systemic flags flipped up. There's a whole autonomic response. All of these things happen. And this one is identifiable, where you have that sort of Pavlovian response where she talks about, when you think of a perfect sandwich, in this case, a BLT,
Yeah.
you start to drool a little. You get the saliva suddenly appearing. So when you think about it, it creates the physiological response. You breathe automatically. You don't think about it.
Yep.
You don't have these things. But she wakes up and she can feel that craving. And this is something that she's imposed on herself because she chose to do this.
Hmm.
And I love how it is not framed as this wonderful positive thing, but she thinks about it like what are the positives of this addiction that she has? And she goes, for the addict, piety was the first self-delusion to go, because you realize that there are things that have power over you.
Hmm. Yeah, and you also get a sense that she has a scientific mind. She thinks scientifically because she thinks about the stuff that's automatic, the breathing and the stuff like that. And she also thinks about what these addictions do to her and what she tries to do to counter them. So, her mind thinks in this scientific manner. And of course, we get the direct clue that she's a writer and that these addictions have this give her this sense of humility, which she thinks is necessary for writing.
But what's also interesting is it also shows how she and we rationalize things. She's created a reason why this is good. And it's interesting. It is a very human portrayal, this flaw, this weakness that she exhibits. And in conveying this, it gives us an insight into her character, not only her habits, the caffeine and the nicotine, not only into how she thinks about things, as you point out, that scientific, the listing and going through and developing different ways to list, think about, organize the information, then see the connections between information, then see how different information, how other things are slightly different. They are of a different type, a different kind. And what we get in the middle of this was general edginess for both, the wordless want awaiting articulation. And this is all nervous fidgeting. What she is going through, what we are seeing here is the nervousness because she's woken up, she's on edge, and this is how her brain nervously goes through things. And it's a way of almost calming her down, is she's trying to understand what is happening, listing the body's processes, focus on the self first. If you wake up and you don't know where you are, you focus on yourself first, then you focus on your surroundings. So it's like you almost check, am I injured? Is something wrong? Then you expand that awareness outwards into the room, and then from there outwards again, and you localize yourself. And that's what we get here, that she starts with this immediate thing that she is feeling, goes through the process because she's on edge. And it just is, it's a different way of showing us the character rather than telling us. Samantha August
Yeah.
was agitated.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is showing us and
She's
helping us here.
addicted. Right. Yeah. No, that's right. It definitely shows us what she's going through. And it also shows us that she's not prone to blind panic where she's thinking of nothing but fight or flight. She's actually, like you said, going through the motions and going through checking her senses and her body and trying to figure out what's going on with her.
And I have to admit, I do like the wordless want awaiting articulation. I like how those words feel when you say them. I like how they sound in your head, because it's that drawing you forward because of the alliteration. The wordless want, it joins those things together, awaiting articulation, and that sort of then draws it out again. But it creates this wonderful phrase, and again, some people will like it, some people don't. But me, that little turn of phrase there is, representative, because we now find out that she is a writer, and so she thinks in literary terms.
Right.
And when we compare that to the prologue, where the prologue was much more stark, much more journalistic,
Right.
this has more of a turn of phrase. This has more of a polish, because this is focalized through Samantha August, the
Her
character. This
her point
is
of view. Yep.
this is her voice. This is how she sees the world. This is how she thinks, as opposed to the almost the camera lens that was reporting what was happening in the prologue. And so this is a different style that it works its way in, that we can expect certain points of view to be written differently because this is the style that's being used, focalization through character.
Nice. Yeah, I like that you pointed out that that alliteration. That's wonderful. I'll have to write that down and use it sometime.
But I think my favorite part of this, the thing that gives you a real sense of the complexity of August as a character, it yanked the stick out of the ass. That she
Yeah.
is, in some respects, no nonsense. So you've just seen the self rationalization of why it's okay to have these addictions, and then it's a no. It it gives a grounding to her character. She's not some
Right.
cerebral, elitist ivory tower locked away in a garret style of author. She's down to earth. She's grounded, and
Yep.
she's not afraid of a little tiny bit of tinge of blue to her writing, to her thinking, to who she is. She's a say it as you see it, but it's that combination of her intelligence, her thought process, and a grounded personality, and that comes across.
Yep. And that practicality relates to the humility in the beginning of that paragraph there. You know, she's intelligent enough to put all this stuff together, learn it enough, but yet she still has that practicality that, you know, being in the situation where she's in a situation she doesn't know anything about. She just woke up. She knows she's addicted to caffeine and nicotine, and so that gives her the sense of humility to revert to that kind of practicality at the end there. That, like I said, down to earth, uh, phrase that just adds so much to her character there.
And her admission that she is flawed, her admission that
Yeah.
she is human, her admission that she isn't perfect. And that is important to realize that we are not perfect, to realize that we are flawed is the first step in trying to see things from other people's perspectives, which is, what she's tying into here, the humility that was useful for a writer. That's part of her process.
All right, very good. Any last little tidbits out of this section?
Um, something had popped into my head there, and it's just popped right back out again.
Okay, well, that's a very thorough episode of Reading the Prose. Oh, one
I,
more.
I, I've just remembered. Can you put it
You
back up?
found it. You found it. All right.
Right. No. So okay. Think of what she's talking about at the beginning here about these things that are assumed a necessary part of life, then things that we are addicted to.
Yep. The communication between the body and the mind. Yep.
Right. Then think about what the book is about. Think about how there are certain aspects of life that we regard as absolutely normal and are automatic and important, and then things that actually have that create that response in us, but they are our addictions. And what we have here is the pointing of this out, a list of the more obvious exchanges. The
Right.
other exchanges were far subtler, beneath notice.
Beneath. No. Yeah.
And
Right.
what this book is about is a deconstruction and exploration of some of the things that we take for granted, that we think of as that we are automatically part of how we perceive the world, but are not necessarily a necessary part of the world. That they are our addictions. They are one way of doing it, and that is actually flagged here. That she personifies what we are about to explore.
That is key and fascinating, I gotta say.
So sorry for only
That's
remembering that it just popped out of my head. So
better to remember than not to say it at all, right? Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, AP, for joining me on this special episode of Reading the Prose. And I will put, of course, your link and stuff below. And everybody be good to each other. And thank you so much for joining us.